Okay. Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Center for the opening session in this, the fifth and the penultimate part of our sixth semester exploration of natural landscapes and human meaning. We began this adventure in the fall of 2022 and traversed our way through the world's oceans, deserts, forests, and last semester the frozen realms. This semester, as I'm sure you've inferred, we will be scaling the vertiginous heights of the mountain. And in this, our regular Tuesday series, we've assembled a range of contributors from across the university, all of whom will address the topic from their distinctive disciplines and perspectives. Our gallery exhibitions this semester are devoted to the mountainous theme. In the second half of the semester, we will be screening Yang Fudong's remarkable film, Moving Mountains. And currently on display here, we have a stunning exhibition titled The Mountain After Hokusai. I would encourage you to take a look at this exhibition after today's session. There will be a drinks reception happening as soon as we finished speaking in here, so do stay for that and take in this wonderful exhibition while you're at it. On the subject of those exhibitions, I really need to extend my deepest thanks to Derek Cartwright, who has overseen our gallery operations since we opened back in 2016 and has consistently staged the most remarkable and stimulating shows here. I am enormously grateful too to the set of speakers, all 21 of them, who will be contributing their time and their expertise to the illumination of this semester's topic. No series like this would be possible without the tireless work of the permanent personnel of the Humanities Center, Maggie McRae, who's been stopping me from having a nervous breakdown about technology today, and of course here from the very beginning, the incomparable Lindy Veer. And of course, what would we do without the steering committee of the centre? My great colleague and friend Ron Kaufman, and our dean Noel Norton. It becomes increasingly clear that no humanities program or centre in a time like this would thrive were it not for a committed and involved college dean. And in the person of Noel, we truly have the very best. Thank you, Noel. Special thanks today are due to the person sitting right next to me, a faculty member who will be my co-presenter in this introductory session, and a person who has been at the driving heart of this natural landscapes and human meaning endeavour, an endeavour, recall, that operates by forging the closest links between the humanities and the sciences. So Beth O'Shea received her PhD in geology from the University of New South Wales, Australia, and was subsequently a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University. Professor in the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences, Dr. O'Shea is a specialist in the field of arsenic geochemistry, with a particular interest in the health and environmental impacts of contaminants in waters, soil, dust, and marine sediment. In recent research projects, Dr. O'Shea has investigated metal contamination from a cannery in Mexico and assessed the transport of arsenic from an abandoned mine in San Diego. She recently completed a Master of Public Health degree at Griffith University in Queensland, and now, indeed, holds an affiliate faculty position at Griffith's School of Medicine and Dentistry in Australia. Dr. O'Shea has also just returned from sabbatical, and we are delighted to have you back, Beth. So this wonderful array of bizarre accents this afternoon. So even if you hate what we're saying, you just sit back and marvel at that.
Just like class.
Now, the last time Beth and I were up here together was at the start of the spring semester of 2023, when we discussed the topic of the desert. We're back here and moving from basin to range, from the desert. See, I did learn something from you. From the desert up to the mountains. I'll say a few words about the array of experiences and judgments that the mountain may evoke in us, and then Beth will take a deep dive into what a mountain actually is. I want to start by thinking about what it might feel like to be told about mountains if one had never before seen such a thing. If one had been born and had stayed in a flat country. There is a gorgeous passage in the diary of Samuel Pepys, greatest of all diarists, an entry written down by him on the 1st of February 1664, and Pepys records how he stopped by a coffee house on the way home from work. Life never changes. You go to work in the 17th century and you go to the coffee. Nothing changes. And he gets into conversation with people, as he always does, and here's something he had never himself seen or experienced, the idea of a mountainous realm. And we should note the utterly transported tone of Pepys's words. Here's the lovely Samuel Pepys. And this is what he says. On my way home, I light unto the coffee house, where I heard Lieutenant Colonel Barron tell very good stories of his travels over the high hills in Asia above the clouds. How clear the heaven is above them, how thick like a mist the way is through the cloud that wets like a sponge one's clothes. The ground above the clouds all dry and parched, nothing in the world growing, it being only a dry earth, yet not so hot above as below the clouds, the stars at night most delicate bright and a fine clear blue sky, but cannot see the earth at any time through the clouds, but the clouds look like a world below you. It is a beautifully poetic passage relaying what it feels like to imagine what these things might be like. And he lived and was born in the east of England, which is an incredibly flat area, so he wouldn't have been aware of this kind of thing. Well, so much for hearing about mountains. What about when we actually see one? The first thing that may immediately strike us about the mountain is that it is astonishing and overpowering in its sheer size and immovability. I recall approaching Grand Teton, this is the Tetons, during a road trip through Wyoming a few years ago, and my breath being taken away by the sight of this enormous and unspeakable wall, this brute thing rising up in front of us as we drive. What sense can we make of such a thing as this? So we may chart a range of responses that the mountain may provoke in people. One very striking and perhaps very strange response was voiced in the 17th century by Thomas Burnet in his fascinating work of geology, The Sacred Theory of the Earth. Burnet looks at the physical world and is somewhat appalled by what he sees. The earth, he thinks, bears all the hallmarks of a catastrophe, rather than of the delicate and perfectly designed world one might expect from an act of divine creation. And for Burnet, there had indeed been a catastrophe, a deluge that left the world in ruins. So the theory advanced by Burnet was that of the mundane egg. It's the mundane egg. It's a beautiful term. Immediately after creation, he says, our world had been perfectly smooth, regular, and spherical, an egg, flawless and of uniform texture. There would have been no hills, no mountains. I quote, says, if you travel it all over, you will not meet with a mountain or a rock. It's more like a billiard ball, like totally smooth. The inside of this gorgeously smooth, mundane egg, on the other hand, was much more turbulent, he says, with layers of fire and water jostling within, cracking under the heating power of the sun, and furthermore torn open by the deity in his anger against human depravity. The great flood destroyed the world's smoothness, leaving afterwards what Burnett calls a world lying in its rubbish. So here we have a very distinctive view of the mountain. Mountains as ruins, mountains as heaps of stones and rubbish. Now, you know, this does not result in an attitude of disdain. The mountains may be rubbish, but they are by no means contemptible rubbish. This is what he says is the title page of the Sacred Theory of the Earth, which is very lovely, I think. Burnett says, the greatest objects of nature are, methinks, the most pleasing to behold, and next to the great concave of the heavens and those boundless regions where the stars inhabit, there is nothing that I look upon with more pleasure than the wide sea and the mountains of the earth. There is something august and stately in the air of these things that inspires the mind with great thoughts and passions. We do naturally upon such occasions think of God and his greatness, and whatsoever hath but the shadow and appearance of infinite, as all things have that are too big for our comprehension, they fill and overbear the mind with their excess, and cast, this is the point, cast into a pleasing kind of stupor and admiration. And yet these mountains we are speaking of, to confess the truth, are nothing but great ruins. And I think that's really remarkable. Alongside the distinctive Burnettian claim that the mountains are ruined forms, we can note two other things. First, that mountains are too big for our comprehension. We can't take them in. And second, that their overbearing and incomprehensible nature can nevertheless evoke in us a specific type of pleasure, what he calls a pleasing kind of stupor and admiration. I think that last point is worth pausing over. You can note here how Burnett is trying to find a striking and a new category by means of which one might capture the feeling one has when experiencing, looking at, contemplating a mountain, a pleasing kind of stupor. It's interesting. Later writers also found it useful to combine two seemingly distinct ideas, pleasure and terror, in order to express this feeling. So, for example, John Dennis, the critic and dramatist, coined the oxymoronic terms delightful horror and terrible joy, so as to convey how it felt to crane one's neck and look up at the towering mountain, or to stand on the heights of the mountain looking down into the abyss below with fear for one's life. That great terrible joy is a great description of that. Now, a similar choice of words is used by John Dennis's contemporary, the great Joseph Addison. You also have to have a picture of Joseph Addison at some point because he looks amazing. And in Addison's book, Remarks on Several Parts of Italy, published very early in the 18th century, he talks about the Alps. And at one point in this book, Addison describes a view of the Alps from the shore of Lake Geneva. Or imagine the Alps here. At one side of the walks, you have a near prospect of the Alps, which are broken into so many steeps and precipices that they fill the mind with an agreeable kind of horror. You've got, again, this idea, terrible joy, agreeable kind of horror. They're playing with fusing two very distinct feelings together into one aesthetic experience. They form one of the most irregular, misshapen scenes in the world. Pause over agreeable kind of horror again. It's interesting in this context, I think, to note that M.R. James, who's possibly the greatest ghost story writer of all, it's coming up to Halloween, so it's time to start reading M.R. James again. James said that the ghost story, properly done, evokes in the reader a feeling comparable to this. James called it a pleasing terror. Again, you've got the same thing, a pleasing terror. Think how much we love listening to ghost stories, or going to those Halloween haunted houses downtown, or watching scary movies. We're terrified, but in a pleasing and delighted way. This is an odd combination of feelings, and you can trace that back as a descriptive term to Addison and Dennis and Burnett. And let's go back to Addison for a moment, because he provides us with a further set of categories by means of which we may appreciate not only mountains, but the whole range of landscapes that we have been considering in our series. Some context for this about Addison. Addison, along with Richard Steele, was the editor of a periodical called The Spectator. Can you see that at the back? It's the articles in The Spectator nicely present to us now the social and literary culture of London during the reign of that most unhappy and gouty of queens, Queen Anne. Addison's essays in The Spectator were exercises in what he called the polite arts, and were designed so as to provoke polite conversation at the breakfast table, at the coffee house, and at the tavern. I like to think that our programming here at the Humanities Center is a continuation of that polite Addisonian ideal, that people listen to us, then go down to the brew house or wherever and talk about art, etc. Now, far from being merely an idle enterprise, one intention of Addison's highly urbane project was to provide a framework for a harmonious and pluralistic civil life profoundly needed during a time of violent division in society. Sounds vaguely familiar. Addison's polite community of talk and conversation provided a model of tolerant civil society in which disagreement could be productive rather than destructive. Now, one of the lengthier and more ambitious pieces in The Spectator was a linked series of essays called The Pleasures of the Imagination. And it is a piece supremely illuminating for the entirety of our landscape series, and specifically for the mountain. Addison begins The Pleasures of the Imagination by appealing to the great value that taste and imagination have for the cultivation of a rich and rewarding inner life. A person of polite imagination, he says, is let into a great many pleasures that are closed to those who are more, I'll use his word, vulgar. He says, he meets with a secret refreshment in a description and often feels a greater satisfaction in the prospect of fields and meadows than another does in the possession of them. It gives him indeed a kind of property in everything he sees, and makes the most rude, uncultivated parts of nature administer to his pleasures. This, as you can see, is very pertinent to our landscape project. Here we have subjected various landscapes and environments, the desert, the forest, and so on, to a multi-dimensional analysis and exploration in such a way as, hopefully, to reveal to us what Addison calls a multitude of charms. We come to love and appreciate these things without owning them, without possessing them. Now, Addison next provides a threefold categorization of the pleasures of the imagination. He puts it this way. I shall first consider those pleasures of the imagination which arise from the actual view and survey of outward objects. And these, I think, all proceed from the sight of what is great, uncommon, or beautiful. There may indeed be something so terrible or offensive that the horror or loathsomeness of an object may overbear the pleasure which results from its greatness, novelty, or beauty. But still, there will be such a mixture of delight in the very disgust it gives us as any of these three qualifications are most conspicuous and prevailing. Now, we can say a word about each of these categories, the beautiful, the novel, and the great. Beauty clearly is a source of pleasure for us. Things that are beautiful, whether they be words, images, sounds, people, captivate us and, to use a Burkean image, soften and relax the tense fibers of our physical being. I would say more about beauty here, but we devoted an entire semester of Humanities Center programming to the subject of beauty about 5 years ago. And if you weren't here for that, I feel sorry for you. As for the novel and the uncommon, Addison argues plausibly that new things fill the soul with an agreeable surprise. We get tired, he says, of seeing the same old thing, so that when any change is present, it serves a kind of refreshment to us. Novelty adds even further pleasure to what is already beautiful. His examples, groves, woodlands, and fields are all at their most enchanting at the start of seasonal changes, at the verdant opening of the spring, and when the leaves in autumn start to turn gold. It is, of course, this novelty which makes people head to New England for the fall. It may be novelty too, which makes USD students and faculty gather at the library steps to watch each day's fugitive and always original sunset. It's always different. It's changing. The sky changes every second. If it was like that all the time, you'd probably just ignore it after a while. It's the changes that matter, the novelty of it that matters. But it's Addison's third category of greatness that applies most of all to the theme of the mountain. Here he says, by greatness, I do not only mean the bulk of any single object, but the largeness of a whole view, considered as one entire piece. Such are the prospects of an open country, a vast, uncultivated desert, of huge heaps of mountains, high rocks and precipices, or a wide expanse of waters, where we are not struck with the novelty or beauty of the sight, but with that rude kind of magnificence. I mean, rough, it means rude in that sense. Rude kind of magnificence, which appears in many of these stupendous works of nature. Our imagination loves to be filled with an object or to grasp at anything that is too big for its capacity. We are flung into a pleasing astonishment at such unbounded views and feel a delightful stillness and amazement in the soul at the apprehension of them. That's a gorgeous idea of the stillness and amazement in the soul when you see something as great as a mountain. Though Addison does not use this word, we are clearly here in the territory of the sublime. The mountain meets those elements characteristic of the sublime as enumerated by Edmund Burke, elements that we have had reason to return to time and again throughout this series. And those elements are vastness, magnificence, obscurity, terror, and so on. Burke, interestingly, contends that a vast length, a flat length, is much less productive of the sense of the sublime when it is at ground level, right, a plane, than when it is a length of height or depth. So if it's something a mile long, if it's that way, horizontally, it doesn't evoke much in us. But if you look up a mile high, or he says even worse, if you stand on the edges and look down, it produces this sense of the sublime. Here's where he says it. It's just repeating what I've said. 100 yards of even ground will never work such an effect as a tower 100 yards high, or a rock or mountain of that altitude. Burke has a theory about why this might be so. It's something he thinks to do with the tension in the eyeball when it tries to take in heights and depths rather than... But we don't need to worry about that. I talk about Burke far too much. So I'm going to say a little more about this matter of the sublime by brief reference to a very different philosopher, William James, in a really great book from 1902, The Varieties of Religious Experience. James, in this book, links the sublime to the idea of the incomprehensible. There are things, he says, that are too vast, too obscure, too overwhelming to be brought into our understanding. Certain natural things. That's why it's interesting to... Beth and I teach a class together occasionally, talk about this kind of stuff. The extent to which the sciences are able to comprehend things, perhaps more than in the field of aesthetics, but that's a story for a different time. James, interestingly, provides examples of this in, first of all, the aesthetic contrast between Catholicism and Protestantism. So we can move in this direction for a second. Protestants, such as myself, may pride themselves on the spiritual purity of their faith and the ridding of superstitious extravagances. But, says James, through the lens of sublime incomprehensibility, the Catholic faith offers a so much richer pastorage to the fancy. Protestantism manifests merely, he says, the almshouse physiognomy. It's basic, it doesn't have the heights. His second contrast of incomprehensibility is drawn from politics, about the question of a republic versus a monarchy. Small R republicans, Commonwealth people, may sneer at it, but it's monarchy that displays the characteristics of the incomprehensible sublime, the mystery, the obscurity, the subliminal fears, while the Commonwealth or the Republic has to make do merely, James says, and I quote, with a president in a black coat who shakes hands with you. That's far less interesting, someone in a suit than someone clothed in regal attire. That's much higher, much more astounding. This is contentious, of course. As for the mountain, it too displays that sublime incomprehensibility. The mountain is just too much for us to take in. It's too obscure. Our eyes hurt when we try and take it all in. We can connect this also with a religious feeling. It's perhaps natural that the vertiginous heights of the mountain should traditionally have been the home of the gods. It is in such a sublime and elevated realm that the divine may naturally have been located. The perspective of the mountain, like the perspective of the gods or of God, is high above us. We can think about that perspective for a moment. The prophet Isaiah, speaking of God's viewpoint, of the viewpoint of, I quote, he who sits above the circle of the earth. The inhabitants of the earth are like grasshoppers or mere insects to God. Now, we want to think about how like the view from the top of a mountain that is. When we look down from those heights, how small do human concerns and human troubles seem? How relativized does it all become? And I take it that something of this kind is happening in that volume of John Ruskin's Modern Painters, where Ruskin addresses, beautifully expressed, the theme of the mountain gloom and the mountain glory. Here's a lovely passage. This is Ruskin. Far up the glen, the sky is seen through the openings in the pines, thin, with excess of light, and in its clear, consuming flame of white space, the summits of the rocky mountains are gathered into solemn crowns and circlets, all flushed in that strange, faint silence of possession by the sunshine which has in it so deep a melancholy, full of power. yet as frail as shadows, lifeless like the walls of a sepulchre, yet beautiful in tender fall of crimson folds like the veil of some sea spirit that lives and dies as the foam flashes. It's quite a vertiginous style of writing that Ruskin has. Fixed on a perpetual throne, stern against all strength. And here's the line I like, lifted above all sorrow. And he then repeats that thought powerfully of the mountain, high above all sorrow. There's this stuff down here, and then high above it, untouched by it, unmoved by it, this incredible stern mountain. Maybe this is part of the abiding appeal of the mountain, the kind of thing we want to think about in this series. A solid, immovable thing, transcending all our day-to-day concerns, high above our sorrows, and a source of infinite inspiration to our imaginations. I'll just close my remarks with a lovely line from Wordsworth, which summarizes all of this, really, because I am still a lover of the meadows and the woods and of mountains. And we, in this series, want to think about why it is that the mountains should inspire our love in such a way. And the first person who's going to help us understand this, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Beth O'Shea. Over to you, Beth.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. And thank you all for coming today. So I think Brian's earlier introduction indicated that I am here to provide a geologic perspective on mountains. And I also hope to convince you that mountains are responsible for more things in your everyday life than what you may realize, from something you may have consumed today to a device that you may have used, or even something that you're wearing, like jewelry. I'm also going to talk about some Australian mountainscapes, and having just returned from home, it's very common to give an acknowledgement of country, which is slightly different to the land acknowledgements we do here. In an acknowledgement of country, a non-Indigenous person will give respect to the traditional custodians of the land and pay respect to the elders past and present. This image here is not from Australia. This is from Italy. This village here is my great-great-grandfather's village, and it sits on a saddle between two volcanoes. So I'm standing on one and taking a photo of Monte Tepori, and that gives you an indication of the type of mountain I'm going to talk about today. On this PC, forgive my, such a Mac person. I'm going to start at the base of the mountains, low in the desert. This is Racetrack Playa in Death Valley, and Brian has alluded to a course that we teach together. It's called the Desert Sublime. We take students to Death Valley. And in preparing for that course, he had this conversation with me a few years ago about how when he was a little boy in England, reading his bedtime stories with his glass of Horlicks, he told me about this story of these rocks on the other side of the world, in a place called Racetrack Playa. And these rocks, or these stones, they moved and they left these great tracks behind them, and nobody knew how they moved. And it was this mystery of his childhood. And as he finished, I very excitedly jumped up and down and I said, no, we know how they move now. And his face dropped. And we subsequently built into our curriculum a series of classes on, does science remove the mystery from our big questions? And so my goal today was to not disappoint Brian with the science not removing any mystery, particularly since all the brochures that I see for the mountain series I see his words here, you know, the power of the mountain to captivate, enchant, and repel. And I thought, ooh, this is going to be hard. Because to a geologist, the word mountain, and I hope I don't offend, the word mountain is so bland. I didn't tell him what I was going to say. For what I want to think about or see or explain when I see a mountain landscape. So I started by looking up the geologic definition for the word mountain. And I went online to the US Geological Survey and found out who does these definitions. And I found that the Board on Geographic Names does not have an official definition of hill, mountain, or peak. And so I thought, all right, how am I going to explain how a geologist sees the magic in mountains? So to start, this visualization from NASA is draining the oceans. And every second is 10 meters of sea level decline. So it's revealing what the bottom of the ocean looks like if we were to remove all of the water. And it's magnificent. And there are huge, vast mountain landscapes on the bottom of the ocean. So, you know, when I say the word mountain is bland, I still have a great appreciation for mountains. It's just that in a geologist's mind, they're really a pimple on the Earth's crust in terms of the scale of the Earth. But I think the magic lies in the way the mountain was formed. And so when I look with a geologist's eye at different mountainscapes, I'm not necessarily looking at that pimple, but I'm looking at the story behind its formation. And so we have the Italian Alps that Brian talked about in the top left. We have the Matterhorn in the top right. And in the bottom image, we have the very imposing Mount Vesuvius over the city of Pompeii. And so if we think about how they're formed, this is where I think their magnificence is. So I'm going to show you plate tectonics from grade school. This video is going to show two ways that mountains form. So the first way is you get continental crust together and just crumpling into a mountain. And then the other way is you have two crusts coming together and one of them will sink. And as it sinks, it melts and forms volcanoes. So there's a little bit of music here, but I believe it's not that loud. Oops. Okay, so I told you at the start that I wanted to try to convince you that mountains are part of your everyday life. And this is one example. In that video, the first set of continental crusts coming together to crumple, that is how the Himalayas formed. And so here we have the Himalayas, but they're exaggerated 50 times, just to show that stark contrast with the country of Bangladesh directly below in the center. So Bangladesh is formed basically from, or it sits on, the shedded material of the Himalayas. So the Himalayas are shedding their fine sand grains into this huge delta in the center of the screen here, which is where the country of Bangladesh lies today. And when those mountains formed, you get this crust coming together, you get two things occurring. Really high temperatures and really high pressures, and they end up dissolving little bits of the rock. And in that hot fluid, you have things like gold from jewelry. I'm just giving you the bird. Gold from my mountain jewelry here. You have things like copper that you might have used in your wiring. All of those rare metals in any kind of electronic device, they're all formed in mountains. But for the people of Bangladesh, they have an additional problem because in the Himalayas, when those mountains formed, there is a lot of naturally occurring arsenic. And that arsenic has shed off the Himalayas and now forms that sort of floodplain, the flat land. The Bangladeshis have drilled wells into that land, and now that groundwater is naturally enriched with arsenic. So that's because of mountains. Okay, so I've sort of touched on how the Himalayas have formed with that collision of tectonic plates. We've looked at how volcanoes formed, and I'll do that a little bit more. But I also want to talk about the processes acting upon mountains. The Matterhorn in the top right, does anyone know what causes that shape? Very distinctive shape. Wind, yeah, good. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Glacier, yes, ice. Glaciers have a wonderful ability to carve the mountain landscape. And so on the left here, you see a lovely wide glacier with crevasses in it, etc. But if you look at the top where the horn is, you imagine a glacier starting, you can see on this side where the arrow for the cirque is, and on the other side and on the back side of that horn. So where those glaciers start, they carve into that mountain pyramid. And that's why the Matterhorn is called the Matterhorn, because it's a horn, which is a glacial landscape. But ice has wonderful power to shape the landscape, particularly mountains. So I'm going to play for you now a very short video I took last year when I was in New Zealand. And you'll see, I turn to the left and you'll see a much smaller glacier than what's indicated on the left-hand side, and that's because of climate change. But I also turn very quickly further to the left, and you'll see a lovely U-shaped valley, and that U-shaped valley has been carved by ice. Okay. You also saw in the earlier video the two plates coming together and one sinks under the other and it melts and it forms volcanic mountains. And so I wanted to show you some photos of volcanoes because I think in this series to come, we may hear about literature of mountains that is, picturesque and tranquil. And I think we have to remember the power, particularly the rapidness of volcanic eruptions, which can, like they did in Mount St. Helens, it really destroyed the entire shape of this volcanic mountain. And this is another great image from NASA. This is Mount Etna in Sicily. It's one of Europe's most active volcanoes. And it's showing Mount Etna as it inflates and deflates. And that's because the magma chamber below it is filling and then erupting. And we're not seeing the eruption. But once the magma chamber erupts and it empties, the land deflates. And so even though we don't feel it, so there's all these little towns around Mount Etna, they don't feel this occurring all the time, but it really shows that mountains can be dynamic. You know, they're not stationary. Okay, here's the last example of how I would like to sort of portray to you the unexpectedness of mountains and how they can really bring humans back down to earth. On the right-hand side, all those little red triangles are volcanoes. So that's the ring of fire. And the yellow indicates your average flight path between Asia and the USA. And in 1989, just one of those volcanoes, one of those red triangles, erupted. And so what I have for you now is a conversation between a pilot of the airline KLM and the Anchorage Center as that plane unexpectedly encounters the ash cloud.
KLM 867 Heavy is reaching level 250, heading 146. Okay, do you have good sight on the ash plume at this time? Yeah, it's just cloudy. It could be ash. It's just a little browner than the normal cloud, but we don't know. We have to go left now. It's smoky in the cockpit at the moment, sir. KLM 867 Heavy, roger. The left is your discretion. Yeah, we fly well 390 in the black cloud, and the heading is 130.
I think this shows that some mountains need to be respected. So the local mountainous terrain, the other volcanoes, range from 7 to 11,000 feet, and the engines regain power at 13,000 feet. And the most interesting thing for me was watching my two pilot friends listen to that, their faces. Okay. For the last part of my talk, I'm going to take you back down under. And I was listening to Brian introduce this and talk about, the scale of mountains and how humans cannot really, we can't understand this scale. And I come from the flattest continent on the planet. And to me, a mountain is something that I can conquer on a Saturday afternoon bushwalk. And so I couldn't give a talk of mountains without giving that slightly different perspective. So I'm going to give you just two examples of mountains from back home. These are the Glasshouse Mountains. They are World Heritage listed site. And in contrast to the volcanoes that I've been talking about, these are ancient volcanoes that are no longer fed by a magma chamber. So the right-hand diagram is showing in light grey that original shape, the typical cone shape of a volcano. And the darker grey is just the plumbing or the volcanic necks. And that is all that is left for these volcanoes in Australia is the plumbing. And there's a series of them, just like the Hawaiian Islands, because these were formed the same way. So a hot spot was continually feeding through the crust tens of millions of years ago, and now the rest of that volcano has eroded away, and that more resistant magma plug is left. And I wanted to show these photos just to indicate, the land use. The fertile nature of soils is because lava is rich in iron and magnesium. And I think that some of the talks in this series will probably talk about the human connection and like living near a volcano. And the last mountain I'll take you to today is my favorite mountain of all. This is Mount Coolum. This is on the Sunshine Coast in Australia. And literally, I can climb from sea level to the top in 28 minutes. So this is not your massive mountain, but I still feel pretty good when I've conquered it. And Mount Coolum is a great type of mountain because it is a laccolith. And I think that is an awesome word. I don't know what its origins are, but a laccolith in terms of geology is sort of like a failed volcano. So a magma chamber has, like maybe a small magma chamber has an offshoot from a larger one, but it doesn't have enough to feed a volcano and cause an eruption. So it ends up cooling underground. And you see that, that magma chamber in the middle here is more resistant to the rest of the land around it. And so that's why Mount Coolum is sticking up, because it's an old magma chamber and the rest of the land here has eroded away. And Dr. Durai and I were lucky enough to take a group of USD students there a couple of years ago. It was a really great experience because my students in the geology class explained what a laccolith was to the English class, and then the English class told us a Dreamtime story, so an alternative formation story. And I'm going to tell you that today. Okay, so the Dreamtime legend goes like this. Many years ago, during the Dreamtime, a beautiful Aboriginal girl named Marucci was loved by another of her tribe, Coolum, a young warrior whose union to Marucci had the approval of the elders. One day, a mighty warrior named Ninderi, who belonged to a fierce and warlike tribe, stole Marucci while Coolum was out hunting. When Coolum returned and found that Marucci had been abducted, he set off in pursuit, following their tracks. Fearing to demand Marucci's return from such a fierce warrior, Coolum crept into the camp while Ninderi was asleep and set Marucci free before fleeing back to their tribe's territory on the coast. Ninderi was furious when he awoke to find Marucci gone and Coolum's tracks leading her from the camp. He flew into a mighty rage and set out after the young couple. When Ninderi caught sight of them, he threw a nulla, a club, at Coolum, knocking off his head, which rolled into the sea and became Mujimba Island. Coolum's headless body fell and turned into stone, becoming Mount Coolum. The spirit god, known to the Undabi as Burrell, had been watching these events from his crystal throne in the sky and was deeply incensed by Ninderi's foul deed. He struck him down, turning him into stone, where he became Ninderi Crest. Filled with sorrow at the loss of her beloved Coolum, Marucci fled to the Blackall Ranges, weeping so much that her tears flowed down the mountain range to form the Marucci River. As time passed, she decided to try and find Coolum's spirit that had gone from his body. To aid her quest, she transformed herself into a black swan, and to this day journeys up and down the river, flying to the swamps and lakes, searching for the spirit of her treasured Coolum. That is Mount Coolum, which became Coolum's body. His head is over here at Mujimba Island, and the Marucci River was Marucci's tears. To conclude, I hope that you agree mountains are formed by strong forces and shaped by things like ice, wind. That you have likely done something today where a mountain was involved, even though you may not have known it. And mountains can be picturesque, magical, but also unexpected and deadly. Thank you.